Let them eat cake. I bet most of you think you know who said this. If you think this infamous line was muttered by Marie Antoinette, Queen Consort of France, in response to the news of the starvation of her people, you would not be alone in thinking so, but you would be 100% wrong. Antoinette has gotten a terrible story on her page in the history books, most of it being made up of rumors of her time about her being a cruel and wicked queen, an evil Austrian spy, an incompetent ruler, a terrible wife, and having a complete lack of compassion for her subjects. All of this true? Or is there another layer to the story? The short answer is yes. There's a complex, kind, and, dare I say it, brave woman hiding underneath the myths that have long surrounded her reign. Today, we're going to dive in. This may be the craziest episode yet. Today, we're talking about Marie Antoinette.
History forgot them, defamed them, destroyed them. We're putting them back in the narrative. The women lost to history will become the stories you won't forget. This is her story.
Marie Antoinette was born Maria Antonia Josepha Joanna in Vienna on November 2nd, 1755. Youngest of Empress Maria Theresa's 15 children. All of Maria Theresa's daughters bore the same first name as their mother, so all of the daughters after the eldest went by their middle names, so Maria Antonia Josepha Joanna became Antonia, or for a nickname, Antoine. It was thought upon her birth that not much was going to come from the life of the youngest daughter of such a long line of archdukes and archduchesses, and her mother certainly did not think her youngest daughter was going to go on to become the Queen of France. But only a year after her birth, serious political changes were happening in Austria. In 1756, Austria joined forces with their traditional enemy France through the Treaty of Versailles in order to stand against threats from Prussia. It was the Treaty of Versailles that would make it possible for Antoine to one day become the Queen of France. Empress Maria Theresa was a shrewd woman who was very ambitious when it came to marriage alliances for her children. But when it came to Antoine being the youngest of Maria Theresa's 15 children, she was admired by her court but ultimately ignored, especially by her mother, because the Empress deemed that there was no use for her. Because of this lack of attention to Antoine's existence, her education suffered as well. Most of her childhood went without tutors, and by the time she was 14, she could barely read or write. She was, however, extraordinarily gifted at the arts. She was a skilled ballerina. She could play the harp, the harpsichord. She also loved the opera. In 1765, when Antoine's father, the Emperor Francis Stephen, died of a stroke, leaving the Empress scrambling to marry off her remaining daughters. At this point, she only had 5 daughters that had survived childhood. In the coming years, Antoine and her sister Maria Carolina ended up being the only 2 daughters of Maria Theresa. Maria Carolina was quickly married off and became the Queen of Naples, which left only Antoine to take up the torch to become the Queen of France. Antoine was betrothed to the Dauphin of France, Louis Auguste, on February 7th, 1770. He was married by proxy on April 19th. Young Archduchess Antoine was now the Dauphin of France, Marie Antoinette. Before she could arrive formally at Versailles, the royal handover had to take place.
Mops! You can have as many French dogs as you like. It is a custom that the bride retain nothing belonging to a foreign court.
It wasn't until a few days later, on May 14th, that Marie Antoinette actually got to meet her husband. A formal meeting was set up between the Dauphin and the Dauphine in the forest of Compiègne, and then Marie Antoinette was formally brought to Versailles. After Marie Antoinette was formally presented to the crowds at the Palace of Versailles, that same day an official wedding ceremony was held. Even though the young Dauphin and Dauphine were technically already married, this ceremony was the first in many acts of what Marie Antoinette would come to know as the pomp of Versailles. It was time for the royal wedding ceremony, in which the young couple must consummate their marriage. But it would be 7 years before Louis Auguste would have sex with his wife.
In the case of Marie and Louis, they were both sexual innocents. They knew what was expected of them. They knew they were required to procreate, but they didn't understand the mechanics.
It's constant rumors about court against Marie Antoinette for not inspiring sexual passion in her husband, Marie Antoinette was also thrust into life at Versailles, which was known as privacy in public.
One with rights of entry may enter at any time.
It's cold.
Yes. Good morning. Oh, so now the position must go to the Duchess of Chartres, because she is also a princess of the blood. Hello. Oh. So now, as a member of the royal family, your sister-in-law, the Comtesse de Provence, must have the honor.
This is ridiculous.
This, madame, is Versailles.
Just because people let children rule doesn't mean children ever should have been ruling and should have ever been, like, having public bedding ceremonies and, like, being dressed in front of crowds and, you know, just because...
Which is also creepy, even as an adult.
Marie Antoinette turned to her charitable side. She would often take carriage rides throughout the country to get away from the toxic environment of Versailles, and she would often stop her carriage when she saw people sick or wounded on the side of the road. One time she stayed with a man who had broken his leg for hours until a proper doctor arrived.
It was like, okay, well, people are hurting and people are hungry, so I'm going to do something about it.
Other events that caused those around her to insult her began in 1771 when the Princess Lamballe came to court and her and Marie Antoinette became fast friends. It also began around court saying that Marie Antoinette was a lesbian who was in love with the Princess Lamballe, and that is why the Dauphin would not sleep with her, out of disgust.
I don't think it matters. I mean, whatever. Yeah, I mean, like, technically, but, like, technically it does because she was married. I think that they were just trying to kind of tear down her morals as a person to say, like, oh, if she was lesbian, or oh, she was cheating on Louis. It's kind of like, just like an attack at her character.
I think it's difficult to pin the relationship with any specific label simply because there is such a wide range of relationship dynamics and sexual identities, not just today, but in the 18th century as well. So things don't always fit a specific label, but with that in mind, I don't think they saw themselves as lovers in a romantic sense. The intimate relationship between the Princess de Lamballe and Marie Antoinette, along with her relationship with her other favorites, were a part of Marie Antoinette's desire to cultivate this private life within a very public existence.
But Marie Antoinette wasn't just being insulted by the French. Her family also took great enjoyment out of criticizing her too. Marie Antoinette received almost weekly letters from her mother, the Empress, constantly criticizing her daughter, insulting her, and demanding to know why Marie Antoinette had not fulfilled what her mother viewed to be her only purpose, bearing a child. On top of that, Marie Antoinette's advisor, Count Mercy, told her upon her arrival at Versailles to not express any political opinion, for it was not the position of a Dauphine or a Queen Consort. But by 1773, Count Mercy, her mother, her brother, the Empress Joseph II, and the French people at court all began insulting her for her lack of political involvement and opinion.
Queen Consort, especially in France, would have no recognized influence on any kind of policy. However, she would have pillow talk influence. So she could talk to the king privately, and try to put forth things. But I think early on, she was told not to do that by her mother, by Mercy. And so early in the marriage, there was not much influence. But later on, Louis exhibited signs of depression.
Yeah.
And she had to kind of step in. And I'm not sure that she really wanted to, but, it just came down to if she wanted to save the marriage, the monarchy, the government, she had to step in.
Throughout all the insults and rumors, Marie Antoinette did have her moments of happiness. Upon her first arrival at the opera, Marie Antoinette was so overcome with joy at the end that she stood up to applaud, which was not seen as proper in French court etiquette.
Applause is not usually permitted at court performances.
Why not? It was wonderful. Clap, clap, clap.
But the court insults and the familial insults came flying back at Marie Antoinette later that year when her sister-in-law, the Comtesse, bore a child, and Marie Antoinette herself was still in an unconsummated marriage. The Dauphine, Marie Antoinette, was required to attend the royal birth, upon which her sister-in-law demanded, "When will you give us an heir?" The chance of happiness wasn't lost, for later that year on January 30th, Count Fersen came to the opera and met the young Dauphine. Unaware of who she was, he struck up a casual and friendly conversation with her about their shared love of the opera. It wasn't until after he left that he learned just who he had been talking to. Everything changed on May 10th, 1774, when Louis XV died of a heart attack, which made Marie Antoinette no longer the Dauphine, but the Queen of France.
Majesties, I am at your loyal service.
Dear God, guide us and protect us. We are too young to reign.
Two political innocents, that don't really know how to run a country.
Just had no idea that their reign would be the last. Once she was queen, all new rumors and verbal attacks began on Marie Antoinette. In 1775, there were political stirrings happening in France. New ideas of political reform were being put forth by the king's advisors because King Louis XVI was deemed too indecisive to rule on his own, and meanwhile, Marie Antoinette was being continually badgered by her mother, her brother, and Count Mercy that she was not enacting enough influence over the king. Even though technically, as a queen consort, she had no say in the political decisions of her nation. Turned to new ways of combating her loneliness and depression. Gambling, parties, and spending. She liked to have wild parties late at night in her apartments, and she enjoyed spending lots of money on fancy dresses, shoes, and fine jewels, and this behavior of spending and extravagance was criticized by the court, even though such behavior was not really unique for a young queen or for a royal in general.
She was a teenager, and
Yeah.
it was such a reminder, we're gonna play, new and punk kind of
like
music
her and her friends
to show
are at the
she's a
mall.
teen.
To add to her loneliness and depression, her sister-in-law, the Comtesse, soon bore a second child, and Marie Antoinette was distraught by this. She rode out in her carriage and essentially adopted a peasant boy off the side of the road and tried to give him a better life at court than the poverty he was living in. Though this was a great act of charity, albeit done rather selfishly, she was still condemned by her court, seen as pathetic for not being able to bear a child of her own. Since Marie Antoinette hadn't been faced with enough rumors to last a lifetime, even more new ones were being heaped upon her.
And when they went to the queen to tell her her subjects had no bread, do you know what she said?
Let them eat cake.
That's such nonsense. I would never say that.
In the past, Marie Antoinette was insulted for not being able to inspire sexual passion in her husband. She was now being accused of having orgies in the palace gardens and sleeping with numerous men and women.
Became accused of being promiscuous primarily after she became the queen, in other words, after she had been established as a powerful presence at court.
Spent more time with her ladies than with Louis, and then the fact that her and Louis didn't have sex for so long, it could be possible, but I don't know, it could also just be a rumor.
Thankfully though, by 1777, King Louis XVI finally consummated his marriage with Marie Antoinette, and she was soon pregnant. On December 19, 1778, Marie Antoinette finally bore her first child, a girl, much to the court's displeasure, but nonetheless, the king and queen were overjoyed with their new child, whom they named Marie-Therese. 1780, Louis XVI, under pressure from his advisors, decided to send troops to help America in their Revolutionary War, a decision that would ultimately almost bankrupt France. Rather than insult their king, they saw it as easier to insult the foreign queen.
France, the monarchy of France was a big believer in the divine right of kings. So the king could not be questioned. He was above everyone, and he only, spoke to God. That was it.
Yeah.
So, and it was, you couldn't question what he did. So to deflect from that and find another scapegoat, you had to pick someone else. And so Marie was chosen.
And that she'd still have to ask for Louis' permission to do so.
Yeah.
So asking for his permission made it kind of seem like, oh, well, the king is doing this and she's doing nothing. She's out here partying, being with women and all this other stuff.
Marie Antoinette had a personal triumph later that year when she finally bore a son, a new heir, a new dauphin for France, whom she named Louis Joseph. Now that they had a son, Louis XVI was quick to abandon his wife's bed again, and so, after a long-time friendship, in 1783, Marie Antoinette and Count Fersen began their love affair. Of course, she was ridiculed and gossiped about for this, especially when she bore a second son, Louis Charles, who many members of the court speculated was her lover's son and not the king's, but King Louis XVI was very adamant that it was his son, and to his credit, was very chivalrous in his defending of his wife's character. This relentless gossip, however, came to a head in 1785 when Marie Antoinette was framed by a bastard child of the Valois line and a cardinal for supposedly buying a diamond necklace so expensive the crown could barely afford it themselves.
It was just the biggest mess. It's so convoluted. It was another one of those deliberate things that was done to make her look bad.
Even though Marie Antoinette was soon pardoned by the king and the court, this one silly, ridiculous rumor about a necklace is what cemented the belief in the French people's minds that their Queen Marie Antoinette was solely responsible for the financial downfall of their nation and the starvation of their people. In 1787, Marie Antoinette was nicknamed Madame Deficit. She was jeered at by other members at court. She was publicly mocked at the opera. Peasants would no longer take the food she brought in her carriage to give to them, calling out that the wicked queen must have poisoned it.
The portrayal of Marie Antoinette as someone who spent France into ruin or who caused the starvation of the French people through her spending is an unfair one because she did not contribute significantly to the national debt, nor did she cause the conditions which led to starvation and extreme poverty in France.
To make matters incredibly worse, over the next few years, Marie Antoinette bore a fourth child, a second daughter, Sophie, who died just a few months shy of her first birthday. This death of her second daughter was soon followed by the death of her first son, Louis Joseph, which sent Marie Antoinette into the worst depression of her life. Everything was still going to get so much worse. The National Assembly formed in the following years in order to challenge the monarchy and lead the French Revolution. The assaults on the royal family began on July 13, 1789, when a mob of peasants stormed the Bastille, where they believed grain for the royal family to be stored. Violence ensued, lives were lost, and death threats to the Queen alone were made. It was this event that caused many of the royals at court to flee in fear of more impending attacks, but King Louis XVI refused to leave, stating that he was still the father of a nation, and Marie Antoinette, much to her credit, stated that it was her purpose to stay by the king's side, and thus passed up what might have been her only chance to escape. The next attack happened a few days later after the king and queen decided to stay at Versailles at 4 in the morning when one of the queen's ladies found one of the palace guards bleeding to death as he cried out, "Save the queen! They're going to kill her." After several hours, the palace guards finally managed to get the situation under control and get the peasants out of the palace, and the royal family could come out of hiding, but they were immediately put in a carriage to send them to Paris for their safety until June 21st at midnight, when they fled in disguise, trying to escape. After many days of travel and almost getting away with it, the National Assembly caught them and brought them back to Paris to face prosecution. In 1792, King Louis XVI was arrested, accused of acts of treason against the royal monarchy, and soon after him, the rest of the royal family was imprisoned as well. They were kept in a small tower in a medieval convent. The rest of the royal household was taken to separate prisons for interrogation, the Princess Lamballe being one of them. Marie Antoinette begged that the princess be allowed to stay with the royal family since she was a royal relative, but this request was ultimately denied. What happened next was sickening. Innocent princess, who was ultimately guilty of nothing but being friends with the hated queen, was interrogated, violated, and then beheaded. Her head put on one pike, her body cut in half, her intestines spilled out, and then the parts of her body remaining put on a second pike. Defiled and mangled corpse was then paraded joyously through the streets of Paris and brought to the window of the tower where the royal family was kept as they held the Princess Lamballe's severed head up on a pike to the window for Marie Antoinette to see. The sight of her best friend's severed head sent Marie Antoinette into a depression so deep, for a long time, she ceased speaking altogether. On September 24th, 1792, it was finally announced that the French monarchy had come to its end and the National Assembly was now in charge. Louis XVI was put to death by guillotine on January 21st. Having lost her best friend and her husband, the only thing left that gave Marie Antoinette any hope was her children. So of course they took them from her too. Sent her children to separate cells and transferred Marie Antoinette to a different prison entirely. And then her trial began. It's long and tedious and offensive, and in the end, it didn't matter what the truth was, what Marie Antoinette said or did. They had already made up their mind that Marie Antoinette was guilty. Last day alive, October 16th at 4:30 in the morning, Marie Antoinette was given writing materials in her cell, which she used to pen letters to her only surviving sister, Maria Carolina, the Queen of Naples, and to her surviving son and daughter, confessing her love for them, asking that they continue to live their lives and be happy, and telling them not to avenge her death. Later that morning, the executioner came and shorn all her hair as a sign of humiliation, and then bound her hands and put her in a prison cart to be paraded through the streets and jeered at. And her last words were simple. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and before kneeling down to die, she said, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not mean to do it." Marie Antoinette was executed. While so many women were erased or hidden from history, Marie Antoinette's fate in some ways is much worse because she was remembered, but cruelly and mockingly. Centuries later, and we still make fun of her. She's the butt of jokes. She's the comparison for greed and evil.
Women are vilified so much, whether or not circumstances or choices are actually of their making or of their construction or their fault. They're so often the scapegoats and the reasons for so many political failings, and so much of that had nothing to do with her.
Depicting her as cruel and evil served the purposes of those who were trying to, discredit the monarchy, if not just abolish it.
Personally feel like the way that Marie Antoinette was portrayed to me in history is that like she was like this promiscuous person, and so I felt as though in that way I was like, oh, she's sleeping around and doing all these terrible things. I was like, yeah, she totally deserved it. But then after I actually paid attention and read more and looked into her, I was like, well, she wasn't this terribly awful person. She tried to do what she could.
And not only was I sad for her story, but I was also sad and mad that I didn't know it and that I hadn't been educated on it properly.
I hope from now on, when it comes to remembering Marie Antoinette, we stop ourselves and think about it and remember the truth.
Don't say goodbye.
I'm Molly Likovich. This has been Her Story. Thank you for watching.